The blow landed at 0 Harvest, Mark 7 in the conclave's public record. A precise, open-handed strike across the face of a human attaché named Corporal Dara Mwangi, delivered in full view of 43 diplomatic observers, 9 active recording arrays, and the senior military staff of 6 sovereign species. Mwangi did not fall. She did not raise her hands. She did not step back. She stood with her feet exactly where they had been before the impact, blood beginning at the corner of her mouth, and looked at Fleet Commander Vasekari of the Rathine Dominion with an expression that no one in that chamber, not the diplomats, not the military observers, not the 3 xenographic analysts present specifically to document human behavioral responses, could immediately classify. 5 seconds passed. What happened next was not a fight. The conclave of Vareth had stood for 200 years as the galaxy's most carefully engineered neutral space. Its architecture was deliberately disorienting, no species-specific gravity calibration, corridors angled to favor no particular locomotion type, lighting spectra balanced to disadvantage everyone equally. The neutrality was real and it was enforced, not through trust but through the mutual understanding that the conclave was the only place where a Rathine fleet commander and a human military attaché could occupy the same corridor without either of their governments being technically responsible for the consequences. This had seemed, until 0 Harvest, Mark 7, like a feature rather than a flaw. Archivist II Feln Uvar had been stationed at the conclave for 9 years. He had documented 4 disputed boundary negotiations, 2 near-collapse treaty events, and the infamous Solari accession crisis that had required 11 months of continuous mediation. He had watched species scream at each other across tables. He had watched military delegations walk out of chambers with weapons half-drawn. He had never, in 9 years, watched anything that frightened him quite the way those 5 seconds frightened him. Because Corporal Mwangi wasn't supposed to be here at all. That was the first thing. The human delegation's registered composition was 7 personnel. 1 senior diplomat, 2 aides, a legal counsel, and 3 security attaches. Standard configuration. Mwangi was listed as security attaché 3rd class, the lowest-ranking human in the room. She should have been standing at the back of the chamber near the environmental monitoring post, which was where 3rd-class security personnel stood. She should have been invisible. She was standing 3 meters in front of Fleet Commander Vasekari when he struck her. Uvar had been watching the chamber's northwest quadrant when it happened, where the Rathine's secondary delegation was having a heated internal exchange. He'd almost missed it. He'd turned at the sound, a sharp, flat crack, organic impact, unmistakable even across a 40-meter chamber, and found the aftermath already in motion. Mwangi standing, not falling. Vasekari's hands still extended at shoulder height. 5 seconds. Then Mwangi said, very quietly, to someone Uvar couldn't immediately identify, "Timestamp that." The second mystery embedded itself in Uvar's mind during the 17 minutes immediately following the incident, while the chamber dissolved into the controlled chaos of diplomatic emergency response. Vasekari had struck a member of a foreign delegation in a protected neutral space. This was not ambiguous. The legal consequences were established, specific, and severe: formal censure, mandatory suspension of the Rathine's current negotiation standing, possible ejection of their entire delegation. The conclave's oversight mechanism would have to respond. It was not a question of whether but of how quickly. What Uvar had expected was a human protest. A formal objection. Possibly a walkout. Delegations walked out. He had documented 6 walkouts. They were a recognized diplomatic instrument. Instead, the human senior diplomat, a woman named Director Adissa Okonkwo, who had been seated at the primary negotiating table, stood up, straightened her jacket, and said to the chamber at large, in a voice calibrated to be heard without being raised, "The Rathine delegation will want to consider carefully what they've just done. Not, what was done to us. Not, we demand accountability. Not, this is a violation. What they've just done." Vasekari, who was a large being by any measure, the Rathine ran to significant physical mass, an evolutionary inheritance from their predatory history, turned to look at Okonkwo. His secondary jaw plates, which expressed aggression in Rathine physiology, were fully extended. He had hit Mwangi as a demonstration, Yuvar understood now. A calculated insult delivered to show the human delegation their own smallness in a chamber where the Rathine were currently the most physically imposing military presence. Your attaché, Vasekari said, in cooperative standard, was standing in a restricted approach zone. I removed her. That's interesting, Okonkwo said. She was reviewing something on the data surface in front of her. She did not look at Vasekari. That's very interesting phrasing. The chamber's silence had a specific texture. Yuvar had felt diplomatic silence before. The silence of species trying not to say the wrong thing, calculating, weighing. This silence felt different. Like everyone in the room was watching something they didn't fully understand yet, and the not understanding was the frightening part. Corporal, Okonkwo said, still without looking up from her data surface. Mwangi, who had not moved from where she was standing, still 3 meters in front of Vasekari, blood on her chin, said, Director. Did you step into the restricted approach zone? I did, Director. Why? The pause. A very deliberate pause. Because someone needed to. Okonkwo finally looked up. She looked at Vasekari. We'll continue when you're ready, she said, and sat back down. Yuvar stopped writing in his documentation log and stared at the chamber. Mwangi had stepped into the zone deliberately. She had known he would strike her. She had walked into the blow. The third mystery did not present itself until Yuvar accessed the chamber's secondary recording archive 4 hours later, after the session had been formally suspended and the conclave's emergency mediation team had descended in full force. He had been assigned to compile the incident record, standard procedure when a significant diplomatic breach occurred in a monitored space. Review all camera angles. Cross-reference time codes. Build the complete picture. He built the complete picture. The complete picture was not what the primary recording showed. The primary recording showed Mwangi in the restricted approach zone at 0 harvest, Mark 7, Vasekari's strike, Mwangi's non-reaction, and the subsequent 5 seconds. Clean, unambiguous, complete. The secondary recording, a lower-angle array positioned near the environmental monitoring post, angled to capture the chamber's northwest quadrant, showed something the primary recording's field of view had missed. Mwangi had been in the restricted approach zone for 4 minutes and 31 seconds before the strike. 4 minutes and 31 seconds. The restricted approach zone was defined, clearly documented, marked with visible calibration lines on the chamber floor. Anyone entering it without authorization was technically committing a minor protocol violation, not severe, but logged, certainly noticeable. Noticeably noticeable, because the calibration lines were luminescent. You couldn't accidentally drift into the zone. You had to cross a glowing line. Mwangi had crossed the line, positioned herself 3 meters from Vasekari, and then stood there. For 4 minutes and 31 seconds. While he noticed, while his secondary jaw plates extended, while he warned her, Yuvar could see the Rathine's mouth moving, though the secondary array hadn't captured audio. While she apparently did not move. Until he struck her. Until she said, timestamp that. Yuvar sat alone in the archive room for a very long time. She hadn't just walked into the blow. She had stood there and waited for it. She had given Vasekari 4.5 minutes to make a different choice. In full view of recording equipment she had certainly known was running, in a neutral space she had certainly known would preserve every frame of whatever happened next. 4.5 minutes. Yuvar's hands were shaking slightly when he filed the secondary archive footage into the incident record. He wasn't sure yet what he was documenting. He wasn't sure whether what he had just watched was an act of extraordinary courage or something considerably colder than courage. He wasn't sure those were different things. The incident record reached Fleet Admiral Gret Sur of the Rathine Dominion's command structure 18 hours later, by which point the Conclave's mediation team had formally suspended the Rathine delegation's negotiation standing, issued a preliminary censure, and opened a full breach inquiry. These were the expected consequences. Gret Sur was an experienced military strategist and political operator who had anticipated them the moment he'd received initial word of Vasekari's action. What he had not anticipated was the footage. He watched the primary recording and understood it. He watched the secondary recording and did not. She was warned, said his adjutant, Heshkar. Our records show he issued the zone violation notice twice. Yes, Gretzer said. She didn't move. No. Why would she not move? HFY pulled up the secondary footage again. 4 minutes and 31 seconds of Mwangi standing with her hands at her sides, looking directly at Vasekari, not moving. Is this a human pain tolerance display? Some kind of territorial assertion? I don't know. Our behavioral models suggest. Our behavioral models, Gretzer said, did not predict this. He kept watching the footage. He watched Mwangi's face, which was carefully neutral in a way that wasn't the neutrality of suppressed fear. He had seen suppressed fear on 1,000 faces across a dozen species. He knew what suppression looked like. This was not suppression. What did the director say? After the suspension? HFY checked the mediation transcripts. She said the human delegation was prepared to accept the conclave's process. She said, he paused. She said that timing would be at the conclave's discretion, not theirs. And she requested that Corporal Mwangi's medical status not be included in the formal record. Gretzer looked up from the footage. She requested it not be included? Confirmed. The mediation team asked if the human delegation wished to file a formal injury report. Standard procedure for a physical altercation. Director Okonkwo declined. Why would she decline? HFY did not answer. He did not have an answer. Gretzer turned back to the footage. He watched Mwangi's face again. Then he said very quietly, we made a mistake. The censure is manageable. The suspension. Not that mistake. He pointed at the screen. That mistake. He stood up. Get me everything you can find on Corporal Dara Mwangi. Service record, posting history, mission assignments. Everything. You think she's significant? She's a third-class attaché. She walked into a strike from a Rathine fleet commander, Gretzer said, and her only response was to tell someone to mark the time. He moved toward the door. Find out why. Feln Uvar requested access to the human delegation's public accommodation records the following morning, which was within his archival mandate. He was building the incident record. He needed to document all relevant parties. It was completely justified. He also needed to understand what was happening, because the incident record was growing in ways his professional experience had not equipped him to organize. Director Okonkwo had given a brief press statement to the conclave's public information office. The statement contained exactly 3 sentences. First, the human delegation remained committed to the current negotiation process. Second, the incident would be addressed through the conclave's established mechanisms. Third, Corporal Mwangi was grateful for the concern expressed by numerous parties and wished to convey that she was well. 26 delegations had sent formal concern communications to the human accommodation block. Uvar had the routing logs. 26 out of the 43 delegations present at the conclave. Delegations whose species had no formal alliance with humanity. Delegations from species that had never previously expressed any particular interest in human affairs. All of them sending concern. He found Mwangi in the corridor outside the human accommodation block at 0600 station time, which was when he happened to be walking past and which, he would acknowledge to himself later, was not entirely a coincidence because he had looked up the accommodation block's location before leaving his quarters that morning. She was sitting on a bench in the corridor, reading something on a handheld display. Her face had been treated. The injury at the corner of her mouth was covered by a dermal accelerant patch, the kind of thing medical systems applied to soft tissue damage. There was bruising at her jaw that the patch didn't cover. He stopped. He was an archivist. Archivists documented. It was his professional function. Corporal Mwangi, he said. I'm Feln Uvar, archivist second assigned to the incident record. She looked up. She had the kind of face that was hard to read at rest. Not hostile, not open, just attending. I know who you are, she said. I have some questions. For the record. I know, she said. Sit down. He sat on the bench. She set down her display. Up close, the bruising was significant. Rathine physical mass meant that Vasekari's open-handed strike would have been, by any standard measurement, an impact capable of causing serious harm to a human. The fact that she was sitting in a corridor reading at 0600 rather than in the medical bay was, by itself, a data point he filed away without fully understanding. "Why did you step into the zone?" he asked. "That's in the record." "You said someone needed to." "That's not an explanation." She was quiet for a moment. She had a stillness about her that reminded him, uncomfortably, of predator species at rest, not threatening, but the kind of stillness that didn't come from ease. It came from control. The Rathine delegation had been escalating physical proximity violations against our junior personnel for 3 days, she said. Small things, below the threshold for formal complaint, but designed to establish, I think you know the word in cooperative standard. Dominance, Yuvar said. Dominance, she agreed. Below the threshold. Until someone pushed back, it was going to keep escalating. So you gave him a target. I gave him a choice, she said, and recorded which one he made. Yuvar looked at the bruising on her jaw. That was the plan? To absorb the strike. The plan was to make him decide, in front of 43 delegations and 9 recording arrays, whether the Rathine were the kind of species that hit people. She picked up her display again. He decided. You could have been more seriously hurt. Yes, she said. Simply. Not dismissing the concern, not performing bravery. Just acknowledging it as a real factor that had been included in a calculation and had not changed the outcome of that calculation. Yuvar left the bench 10 minutes later with a growing conviction that he was documenting something whose full shape he had not yet seen. Here was what Feln Yuvar did not know, at the point when he walked away from that bench. He did not know that Director Okonkwo had filed a sealed supplementary communication to Earth Command 4 days before the incident, flagging the pattern of Rathine subthreshold intimidation and requesting authority for what the communication described as a structured response. He did not know the response had been authorized within 6 hours, which was unusually fast for bureaucratic approval. He did not know the authorization had come from a specific office within Earth's diplomatic corps, an office whose formal title was the Bureau of Strategic Equilibrium, whose existence was publicly documented but whose operational scope was almost entirely unknown outside its own personnel. He did not know, and would not know for another 3 weeks, that Corporal Dara Mwangi had spent the previous 4 years assigned to that office. Not as a security attaché. As a specialist. The security attaché designation on her conclave credentials was a title of convenience, because the Bureau of Strategic Equilibrium did not publish its personnel categories in any directory that Yuvar had access to, and the conclave's credentialing system required a recognizable classification. He did not know that the Bureau's operational specialty was something that had no precise translation in most alien languages, that the closest cooperative standard phrase was something like consequence architecture, which still didn't quite capture it, because consequence architecture implied design and the Bureau's practitioners insisted that what they did was closer to revelation. The consequences were always already there. The Bureau only arranged for them to become visible. He learned all of this from a second witness. The second witness was a Sulari cultural attaché named Drathmaran, who had been present in the conclave chamber at Zero Harvest, Mark 7, and who came to Yuvar's archive office 3 weeks after the incident with a very specific piece of information and an expression of someone who had been sitting on that information and had decided they could no longer justify continuing to sit on it. I knew what she was doing, Drathmaran said, before Yuvar could ask a single question. Not immediately. But I'd seen it before. Yuvar said nothing. He let the silence do the work. 6 years ago, Drathmaran said, the Sulari accession crisis. You documented it. I was there, Yuvar said. There was a human observer in the room during the 3rd mediation session. She had no formal role. She was listed as a staff assistant for one of the cooperative's legal consultants. Drathmaran pulled out a data chip and set it on Yuvar's desk. That was also Okonkwo. Yuvar looked at the chip. He picked it up. He pressed it to his reader. The file that opened was a recording from the Sulari accession crisis's 3rd mediation session. A session Yuvar had been in the room for, had documented extensively, and believed he understood completely. The crisis had resolved because one of the Solari faction leaders had made a strategic miscalculation in public view, and the resulting loss of standing had forced his coalition to negotiate in good faith. Everyone had documented the miscalculation. Everyone had noted its timing. No one had found an external cause because there hadn't appeared to be one. The faction leader had simply made a mistake. The recording Drathmaran had provided showed Okonkwo standing at the back of the chamber near the legal consultant's table. Staff position. Invisible. Showing a Solari junior aide a document approximately 4 minutes before the faction leader's miscalculation. A document that the aide had then, with the expression of someone who has just realized something they cannot unrealize, carried to the faction leader. She handed him the evidence of his own mistake, Drathmaran said. With perfect timing. In the only moment when using it would produce the outcome she needed. They looked at Yuvar. She didn't cause the mistake. She just made sure it was seen by the right person at the right moment. Yuvar sat back in his chair. 6 years ago. Staff assistant at the Solari accession crisis. Now director, with a specialist named Mwangi, at the current Rathine negotiation. Not improvisation. Not reaction. The same method, 6 years apart, refined. The Bureau of Strategic Equilibrium had been running operations at the Conclave of Varith for at least 6 years, and the Conclave's own archival record, his archival record, had not identified a single one. Because they didn't look like operations. They looked like events. Why are you telling me this? Yuvar asked. Drathmaran was quiet for a moment. Because I've been watching the Rathine since the incident. Their delegation is shaken. Vasekari has been formally recalled, and that's the public part, but internally, our sources suggest Gretsur's entire strategic assessment of this negotiation has been revised. He doesn't know what the humans are doing. He can't find the edges of it. They paused. And I think that's what they want. I think the humans want the Rathine to be in that position specifically. Looking for the edge. Not finding it. The blow, Yuvar said slowly, was not the end of what Mwangi was doing, Drathmaran said. It was the beginning. The timestamp she requested. The medical report Okonkwo refused to file. The 26 concerned communications from delegations who had no reason to involve themselves. They leaned forward. Every one of those things changed the negotiating position. Not because the humans argued for changes. They didn't have to argue. They just made Vasekari's decision visible. And then they waited for the galaxy to respond. Yuvar was already pulling up every human diplomatic incident he had in his archive access. Every session, every registered event, every public record that touched a human delegation in the last decade. He was looking for the other ones. There were 7. The Rathine's formal response to the censure came at the start of the 4th negotiating week, a carefully worded statement of institutional regret that fell short of a full apology by exactly the margin their legal team had calculated was safe. Gretsur had written the statement himself. He had spent 3 days on it. He had measured every phrase against 17 potential responses the human delegation might make, modeling outcomes, calculating thresholds. He had not shown the statement to Vasekari, who had been recalled and was currently facing a separate internal process that Gretsur did not discuss with anyone outside his direct command. The human delegation received the statement. Director Okonkwo read it. Then she passed it to Mwangi, who was seated at the support table behind the main negotiating desk. Mwangi read it. She set it down. Director, said Mwangi, in a voice the chamber could hear. Corporal. It doesn't include the subordinate clause. Okonkwo turned back to the Rathine delegation, across the table. Archivist Yuvar, she said pleasantly, could you confirm for the record what subordinate clause the formal breach protocol requires in statements of institutional regret? Yuvar, who was seated in his documentation position against the chamber wall, understood suddenly that he had been included in this moment by design. He was part of the architecture. He had been part of the architecture for 4 weeks, watching and documenting, and his documentation had been part of the pressure, and his presence in this room right now was a variable that Okonkwo had accounted for. He read from the protocol document. A statement of institutional regret under Conclave Regulation 17C must include explicit acknowledgement of the affected party's right to seek formal redress through established mechanisms. The chamber was very quiet. The statement does not include that acknowledgement, Okonkwo said, which means it is not a compliance statement under 17C, which means the censure suspension is not yet triggered. She folded her hands on the table. We can wait while your legal team prepares a revised version. Gret Sur was watching from the Rathine observer's position. He was watching Okonkwo's face, then Mwangi's face, then the chamber at large, 43 delegations who had just watched the Rathine's carefully calculated apology fall 3 words short of compliance and be caught by the human attaché who the Rathine had hit. He had modeled 17 responses. He had not modeled this one, because this one required knowing the subordinate clause existed. The Rathine legal team had reviewed Regulation 17C. They had reviewed it in summary translation. The subordinate clause was in the original conclave legal text, in the secondary procedural annotation, in language that the summary translation had condensed to a reference marker. Someone had read the full text carefully, looking for exactly this. He turned to Heshkar. She read the original text. Heshkar said quietly, before Gret Sur could speak. When? Before all of this. Heshkar's expression was the expression of someone doing arithmetic that kept returning the wrong answer. She knew about the clause before Vasekari ever struck her. He stopped. She stepped into the zone knowing that the apology process would eventually come, knowing that we would review the regulation, knowing we would use a summary translation because we always use summary translations, and knowing the subordinate clause would be missed. She set the trap before she walked into the blow, Gret Sur said. The blow was part of the trap. The two of them sat with that for a moment. Gret Sur had been a fleet commander before he was an admiral. He had fought in 3 active engagements. He understood force, position, leverage, the geometry of conflict. He understood these things the way his species had understood them for centuries, through accumulated military doctrine, tested against reality. He was looking at something that his doctrine had no category for. She let him hit her, he said, to get him to issue an apology. She knew the apology would be wrong. She knew we'd missed the clause. And when we missed it, he looked at the chamber. At the 43 delegations. At Uvar, the archivist, sitting against the wall with everything documented. She corrected it publicly. In front of everyone who'd already sent concerned communications. In front of the archivist who's been building a record for 4 weeks. Yes, Heshkar said. How do we respond to that? Heshkar was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he said. I don't think there's a response that doesn't confirm what she's already established. What has she established? Another long silence. That we make mistakes, Heshkar said. And that they notice. The revised statement was submitted the following morning. It was compliant. Every clause, every procedural requirement, every annotation from the secondary text. Gret Sur's legal team had spent the night on it. The censure was formally suspended, the breach inquiry closed, the Rathine delegation's negotiating standing restored. The negotiation resumed. What happened inside that negotiation across the following 9 days would become one of the most studied examples in cooperative diplomatic history, not because of its drama, which was minimal, or its conflict, which was nearly absent, but because of the margin. The Rathine signed an agreement in which they conceded, without direct confrontation, every substantive point they had come to the conclave to contest. The contested boundary zones. The resource extraction rights. The transit corridor access that had been driving escalating tension for 3 years. Point by point, across 9 days of formal negotiation, the Rathine position shifted, not because the humans argued more effectively, though they did, but because the Rathine delegation was operating under a specific and unresolvable pressure. They did not know what they had missed. Gret Sur's team had found the subordinate clause. They had reviewed everything else in Regulation 17C in full original text. They had reviewed the other conclave regulations. They had reviewed every procedural document in the archive that touched the current negotiation. They had found nothing else. But they didn't know if they had found nothing else because there was nothing else. or because they were still using the wrong translation. And that uncertainty, the knowledge that the humans had read things they hadn't read, had seen things they hadn't seen, had set conditions before the first session had ever opened, sat behind every Rathine position statement like a weight. On the 7th day, in a recess period, Gret Sur did something that no one present had expected. He approached Okonkwo directly. He stood in front of her in the corridor outside the chamber. He was significantly larger than her, as all Rathine were, a fact that had been the physical reality underlying his fleet commander's decision to strike. And he said, in cooperative standard, "What else have you prepared that we haven't found?" Okonkwo looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like an honest answer or a diplomatic answer?" "Honest." "Then, I'm not going to tell you that." She met his eyes. "But I'd like you to consider what it means that you're asking." He considered it. He went back into the chamber. He signed the agreement on the 9th day. Yuvar published the incident record 6 months later. It ran to 400 pages, which was long for an archival document, though not unprecedented for complex diplomatic events. He included the secondary recording footage, the supplementary communications, the Solari accession crisis cross-reference that Drathmaran had provided, and a documentation of the 7 prior human diplomatic incidents he had identified. He did not include his own conclusions. Archival documents did not include conclusions. They included facts and let the reader draw their own. But in the document's prefatory acknowledgments, a section that convention required but that archivists generally used for boilerplate language about staff and resources, Yuvar wrote one paragraph that was not boilerplate. He wrote, "The events documented here resist the standard framework of diplomatic breach and resolution because the breach was not the event. Careful review of the complete record suggests the breach was a precondition, prepared and accepted by one party as the required cost of generating a specific sequence of subsequent events. This document has been assembled in the belief that what Corporal Mwangi endured in that chamber deserves to be understood as the deliberate act it was, and not as a misfortune that was later resolved. She was not a victim of the incident. She was, in the most precise sense of the term, its architect. Yuvar filed the document and sent a courtesy copy to the Human Delegation's administrative office. Okonkwo replied 6 days later. The message was short. It said, "Thank you for reading carefully." He sat with that message for a long time. Mwangi left the conclave posting 3 weeks after the agreement was signed, reassigned to a new position whose details were not public. Yuvar did not know where she went. He had no official reason to know, and several reasons to suspect that knowing would require access he did not have. He did know, because it was in the public departure manifest, that she left on a civilian transport at 0400 station time, which was very early, the kind of hour when nobody is watching. He knew she had no official send-off, no ceremony, nothing that marked her departure as distinct from any other personnel rotation. He had gone to the docking bay anyway. He didn't fully examine why. She was there, at the transport gate, alone with a single bag. The dermal patch was gone. The bruising had resolved. She looked like someone who had completed a piece of work and was now ready to begin a different piece of work. She saw him. She didn't seem surprised. "Is there anything else for the record?" she asked. "No," he said. "The record is complete." She nodded, picked up her bag. "Corporal." He stopped himself, looked at her carefully. The corridor was empty. No recording arrays in the docking bay access corridor at this hour. No other witnesses. Just an archivist who had spent 4 months documenting something he still did not entirely understand. Was it worth it? She looked at him for a moment. The same attending expression, not hostile, not open, just present. "The agreement holds for 20 years, she said. "Maybe 30 if the subsequent implementation reviews go well." The Rathine's internal position on the subordinate clause issue has already generated reform pressure in their legal core, which will propagate into their next 3 treaty negotiations. She shifted her bag. And 43 delegations at the conclave spent 4 months watching humans demonstrate that you can absorb what someone does to you and turn it into the case against them without throwing a single punch. "That's not what I asked," Yuvar said. The pause. The docking bay's ambient systems made a low cycling sound. No, she said. It's not. She walked through the gate. Yuvar stood in the empty corridor for a long time after the transport's departure tone sounded. He thought about the 4 minutes and 31 seconds. He thought about Gretzer's question in the corridor, "What else have you prepared that we haven't found?" And Okonkwo's response, "Consider what it means that you're asking." He thought about the medical report that was never filed. About the 26 species that had sent concern without being asked. About the way each event had been a door that opened into a larger room, every answer revealing more questions, every question leading deeper into a method that looked like endurance but was built from something the Rathine's doctrine had no word for. He thought about what Gretzer had said quietly to Heshkar when they'd found the subordinate clause. She set the trap before she walked into the blow. In the Rathine military tradition, the willingness to absorb damage was tactical weakness. You absorbed damage when you had no other option. You endured because endurance was the floor, the last resort, the thing you fell to when everything else was gone. You did not choose it. You did not walk toward it across a glowing line on a chamber floor, 4.5 minutes ahead of the moment when it would cost you most. Unless you understood something about pain that the Rathine doctrine had not accounted for. Unless you understood that there are things a galaxy full of civilizations will witness you endure and be changed by, that they will never be changed by any argument you make. That suffering, accepted without retaliation, without breaking, without the loss of one single degree of composure, does to the watching galaxy something that force never does and never can. It makes them ask why you're still standing. And the asking, the galaxy-wide, 43 delegation, 26 concern communication asking, is the actual instrument. Not the blow. Not the apology. Not the clause. The 5 seconds. The stillness. The blood at the corner of the mouth. The voice saying, to no one visible, timestamp that. Yuvar walked back to his archive office in the empty station dawn. On his desk, the complete incident record waited, 400 pages, fully documented, factually comprehensive. He sat down in front of it. He thought about what it would mean, for every species that read this record, to understand that humanity had sent one woman into one room with one instruction that wasn't fight back and wasn't stand down but something that required a fluency in consequence and patience and cost that no other species present had brought to the conclave of Vareth. The Rathine had thought they were demonstrating strength. They had been given a choice, and they had made it, and Dara Mwangi had known which choice they would make before she crossed the line. She had always been the strongest person in that chamber. She had simply needed everyone